Picture this, it's 1967, and you're a 17-year-old boy in high school. Your hair has grown past your ears. You like the way it looks, but your principal calls you into his office. He says your hair violates school policy. He gives you an ultimatum: cut your hair by Monday or face expulsion. Your parents are furious. Your community calls you a troublemaker, but you and thousands of other boys refuse to cut it. This was the hair wars of the 1960s, and the boys won. Before we uncover this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to light. Now, let's dive in together and discover how long hair became illegal for young men, why schools and police treated it as a crime, and how ordinary teenagers brought this absurd ban crashing down. The Hair Wars: How Long Hair Became a Crime in the 1960s. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 1966. The high school hallways smelled of floor wax and teenage sweat. Lockers slammed. Students rushed between classes, their shoes squeaking on polished linoleum. Boys wore pressed shirts and slacks, their hair neatly trimmed above their ears and off their collars. Girls wore dresses that fell below the knee. Everything was orderly, controlled, and exactly as the administration wanted it. But change was coming, carried on the shoulders of a quiet revolution that would be fought not with protests or sit-ins, but with scissors, or rather the refusal to use them. The 1960s hair bans were unlike any other restriction of the era. They were not laws passed by Congress or enforced by federal courts. They were local policies enacted by schools, businesses, and communities across America and parts of Europe. But their impact was profound. For teenage boys and young men, hair length became the most visible symbol of identity, rebellion, and autonomy. And for the authorities, determined to maintain order, long hair represented everything they feared about the younger generation: defiance, moral decay, and the erosion of traditional values. The obsession with hair length did not emerge from nowhere. It was rooted in Cold War paranoia, generational conflict, and a desperate attempt by older Americans to maintain control over a rapidly changing culture. In the early 1960s, most American boys wore their hair short. The standard style was clean-cut, combed neatly to the side, trimmed regularly at the local barbershop. This was not just fashion, it was conformity. It signaled respect for authority, discipline, and traditional masculinity. Short hair meant you were a good son, a good student, a good citizen. But by the mid-1960s, that conformity was being challenged. The Beatles arrived in America in 1964 with hair that fell past their ears and covered their foreheads. To adults, this was shocking. To teenagers, it was thrilling. Almost overnight, boys across the country began growing their hair longer. It was not a political statement at first. It was simply an attempt to look like the musicians they admired. But what started as fashion quickly became something more. Long hair became associated with the counterculture, hippies, anti-war protesters, drug users, and anyone who questioned authority. Conservative America reacted with alarm. Newspaper editorials warned that long hair was a sign of moral weakness and communist influence. Ministers preached sermons, declaring that long-haired boys were rejecting God's design for men. Employers announced they would not hire anyone whose hair touched their collar, and schools began implementing strict grooming codes that left no room for interpretation. By 1966, hundreds of high schools across the United States had adopted hair length policies. The rules varied slightly by location, but the message was consistent. Boys' hair could not touch their ears, their collars, or their eyebrows. Violators were given warnings, then suspensions, and eventually expulsion if they refused to comply. Schools justified these policies by claiming they were necessary to maintain discipline and prevent disruptions. But the real reason was simpler. Adults were terrified of losing control. It was in this climate of fear and resistance that a boy named Danny Mercer found himself at the center of a battle he never intended to fight. Danny was 17 years old in the fall of 1966. He lived in Cedar Rapids, a Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone else, and conformity was not just expected, it was enforced. Danny was a good student, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of kid who did his homework, helped his mother with chores, and never caused trouble. But over the summer, he had stopped going to the barbershop. It was not a conscious decision at first. He simply forgot to make an appointment, Then another week passed, and another. By the time school started in September, his hair had grown past his ears. Danny liked the way it looked. It made him feel different, less like a carbon copy of every other boy in his town. His friends noticed, and some of them started growing their hair out too, but his parents were less enthusiastic. His father, a veteran of World War II, saw long hair as a sign of disrespect. His mother worried about what the neighbors would say. They told Danny he needed to get a haircut before it became a problem. Danny said he would, but he did not. 2 weeks into the school year, Danny was called to the principal's office. Principal Edward Lawson was a stern man in his 50s who ran the school with military precision. He informed Danny that his hair violated the school's grooming policy. The rule was clear: hair could not touch the ears or the collar. Danny's hair did both. Lawson gave him a choice: get a haircut by the end of the week or face suspension. Danny was stunned. He had not broken any real rule. He had not disrupted class or caused trouble. His hair was simply a little longer than the arbitrary standards set by adults who seemed determined to control every aspect of student life. He told Lawson he would think about it. Lawson said there was nothing to think about. The rule was the rule. That night, Danny's parents insisted he get a haircut immediately. His father said that defying the principal was foolish and would only lead to consequences. His mother said she did not understand why he was being so stubborn over something so trivial. But to Danny it was not trivial. It was about autonomy. It was about the right to make decisions about his own body without being punished for it. Danny did not get a haircut. On Monday morning, he returned to school with his hair unchanged. He was immediately sent to the principal's office. Lawson suspended him for 3 days and sent a letter to his parents explaining that Danny's refusal to comply with school policy was unacceptable. The letter warned that continued defiance would result in expulsion. Danny's suspension made him a minor celebrity among his peers. Other boys asked him why he did not just cut his hair and avoid the trouble. Danny said he did not think the school had the right to dictate how he wore his hair. Some boys agreed. Others thought he was being foolish, but a few began to question the policy themselves. If the school could control hair length, what else could it control? When Danny returned to school after his suspension, his hair was still long. Lawson suspended him again, this time for a week. Danny's parents were furious. They argued with him, pleaded with him, threatened to ground him indefinitely, but Danny refused to back down. He said that cutting his hair would mean accepting that the school had the authority to make personal choices for him, and he was not willing to do that. News of Danny's defiance spread through the school. A small group of boys, 5 at first, then 10, then 20, stopped cutting their hair in solidarity. They were not hippies or radicals. Most of them had no interest in politics or protest. They simply believed that Danny was right. The school's grooming policy was arbitrary and unjust, and if Danny was willing to fight it, they would support him. The administration responded with force. Boys with long hair were pulled out of class and sent home. Parents were called. Suspensions were handed out. Principal Lawson held an assembly to remind students that grooming policies existed to maintain order and prepare students for the real world. He said that employers would not hire young men with long hair, that colleges would reject them, and that their futures were being jeopardized by foolish rebellion. But the message had the opposite effect. More boys started growing their hair. Some did it out of genuine conviction. Others did it simply because they resented being told what to do. The issue was no longer about hair. It was about control, authority, and the right of young people to have a say in their own lives. Danny's parents eventually stopped fighting him. His father still disapproved, but he was tired of the constant arguments. His mother worried about Danny's future, but she also recognized that her son was not a troublemaker. He was standing up for something he believed in. They told him they did not agree with his choice, but they would not force him to cut his hair. By the spring of 1967, more than 50 boys at Cedar Rapids High School had been suspended at least once for hair length violations. The local newspaper ran a story about the controversy, framing it as a clash between tradition and rebellion. Some community members supported the school, saying discipline was necessary. Others questioned whether hair length was really worth all the conflict. And a few parents, frustrated by seeing their sons punished for something so trivial, began organizing. One of those parents was a lawyer named Margaret Foster. Her son had been suspended twice for refusing to cut his hair. Foster believed the grooming policy violated students' constitutional rights. She offered to represent Danny and the other suspended boys in a legal challenge against the school district. Danny's parents were hesitant. They did not want to escalate the situation, but Danny agreed immediately. The lawsuit was filed in the summer of 1967. It argued that the school's grooming policy was an unconstitutional infringement on students' freedom of expression. The case attracted attention beyond Cedar Rapids. Similar lawsuits were being filed across the country as more schools cracked down on long hair. The battle lines were clear. Schools insisted they had the authority to regulate student appearance. Students and their advocates argued that personal grooming choices were protected by the First Amendment. The case took months to wind through the courts. In the meantime, Danny and the other boys continued attending school with long hair, enduring suspensions and constant harassment from administrators. Teachers were divided. Some supported the students, believing the grooming policy was outdated and petty. Others sided with the administration, insisting that discipline required strict rules. In early 1968, the court ruled in favor of Danny and the other students. The judge found that the school's grooming policy was overly broad and infringed on students' constitutional rights. The school district was ordered to revise its policy. The ruling was narrow. It did not declare all grooming codes unconstitutional, but it was a victory. Boys could no longer be expelled simply for having long hair. The decision emboldened students across the country. More lawsuits were filed. More schools were forced to relax their grooming policies, and more young men grew their hair long. Not just as a fashion choice, but as a statement. They would not allow adults to dictate every detail of their lives. The hair wars continued throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Some schools stubbornly held onto their grooming codes. Some communities passed ordinances banning long-haired men from public spaces. Employers continued to refuse to hire anyone with long hair, but the tide had turned. Long hair became so widespread that enforcing bans became impossible. The cultural shift was undeniable. Young people were asserting their right to self-expression, and adults were losing the fight to stop them. Danny Mercer graduated from high school in 1968 with his hair still long. He went on to college, where grooming codes did not exist and students wore their hair however they pleased. He never saw his hair as a political statement, but he understood that his refusal to cut it had been part of something larger. He had challenged arbitrary authority and won. The hair bans of the 1960s were never about hygiene or professionalism. They were about control. Adults who felt the world slipping away from them latched onto hair length as a symbol they could regulate. If they could not stop the anti-war movement, the sexual revolution, or the collapse of traditional social hierarchies, they could at least force boys to keep their hair short. But even that small victory eluded them. The young men who refused to cut their hair were not revolutionaries. Most of them were ordinary teenagers who simply wanted the freedom to look the way they wanted. But in refusing to comply, they forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Arbitrary rules that exist only to enforce conformity have no real legitimacy. And when enough people refuse to obey, those rules collapse. Today, the idea that schools once expelled boys for having long hair seems absurd, but it happened. Thousands of young men were suspended, expelled, and denied opportunities simply because their hair touched their ears. They fought back, not with violence or grand protests, but by refusing to cut their hair, and they won. Danny Mercer never became famous. His lawsuit was one of many, but he was part of a movement that reshaped American culture. The hair wars taught a generation that they did not have to accept every rule imposed on them. They could question authority, they could resist, and if they stood together, they could win. The long hair bans are gone, but the lesson remains. Every generation faces rules that are designed not to protect or improve, but to control. And every generation must decide whether to comply or to push back. The boys of the 1960s chose to push back, and in doing so, they claimed the right to define themselves on their own terms. Danny Mercer kept his hair long for most of his life. He cut it eventually, not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to. And that choice, the freedom to decide for himself, was the victory that mattered most. The hair bans are long gone, but the pattern is still with us. Every generation faces rules designed not to help or protect, but simply to enforce conformity and control. It makes you wonder what restrictions exist today that future generations will look back on and shake their heads. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments, what modern rule or expectation do you think will seem absurd in 50 years? And if you want to discover more forgotten stories of ordinary people who refuse to accept arbitrary authority, subscribe to the channel. History is full of people like Danny Mercer, teenagers and young people who changed the world simply by refusing to comply. Let's keep uncovering their stories together.